A faint shift can be felt across North America, the kind that grows quietly until it becomes impossible to ignore. It does not rise from a battlefield or a financial collapse. It arises from the dust of riverbeds that have ceased to flow and landscapes where fertile ground is turning into cracked earth. As the heat intensifies, the longest, undefended border in the world is facing a pressure test that no treaty ever prepared it for. The struggle is elemental, and the conversation took a sharp, irreversible turn when Donald Trump shifted national attention toward a reality few dared to speak aloud. With the American West parched and reservoirs sinking toward Deadpool status, he pointed a finger at Canada's vast, pristine lakes. His suggestion was simple, yet terrifying. The United States is running out of time, and the solution lies in the water reserves of its northern neighbor. It did not sound like a request. It sounded like a warning from a thirsty giant that is no longer willing to wait for rain. South of the border, the reality is stark, dusted in the blinding white of mineral deposits that line the canyon walls of the American Southwest. The region has reached a breaking point that experts predicted decades ago, but few were truly prepared to witness. The Colorado River, once a thundering artery of the continent, is being strangled by overuse and a climate that has turned hostile. The crisis is most visible at Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the two massive reservoirs that serve as the heartbeat of the Western water supply. Today, they are skeletal versions of their former selves. Boat ramps that once floated on deep blue water now end abruptly in barren dust hundreds of feet from the shoreline. The bathtub rings, stark white bands wrapping around the reservoirs, serve as a visual measurement of how far the water has fallen, standing like tombstones of a wetter era. Cities that bloomed in the desert are now entering a permanent state of conservation. In Arizona and California, the agricultural districts that feed the world are hemorrhaging. Farmers are fallowing fields, abandoning crops, and watching generations of livelihood evaporate under a relentless sun. The American West is not just facing a drought, it is facing a fundamental shift in habitability. Shift the gaze northward, however, and the landscape undergoes a radical transformation. Cross the 49th parallel, and the color palette shifts from scorched earth to deep, endless blue. Canada is arguably the hydrological superpower of the planet. Nearly 1/5 of all the fresh surface water on Earth resides within its borders, held in a staggering mosaic of rivers, wetlands, and glaciers. Here, water is not a scarce commodity fought over in courtrooms, it is a defining element of existence. Towering lakes spread across the provinces like inland seas, and rivers run wild and free for thousands of miles, feeding ecosystems that have remained unchanged for millennia. For Canadians, this abundance is woven into the national identity. It influences the rhythm of daily life, the culture, and the economy. While the American West scrapes the bottom of its aquifers, Canada looks out upon a surplus so vast it is almost impossible to comprehend. It is this glaring disparity between a neighbor dying of thirst and a neighbor drowning in riches that has set the stage for the inevitable collision. In the face of such desperate disparity, the American response has moved beyond wishful thinking into the realm of serious engineering. To many in the United States, particularly those watching their cities dry up, the solution seems frustratingly obvious. If Canada has a surplus of water that exceeds its domestic needs by orders of magnitude, why not let that fresh water flow wastefully into the ocean? Why not redirect it to a neighbor facing an existential emergency? This logic has given birth to proposals that rival the boldest infrastructure projects in history, transcontinental water diversions. The concept is audacious. It envisions a network of massive pipelines, pumping stations, and canals stretching from the glaciated waterways of British Columbia and Manitoba down to the parched basins of Nevada and California. Proponents argue that we already possess the technology to move liquids across continents. We have spent the last century building intricate webs of pipelines to transport crude oil and natural gas from the Canadian oil sands to refineries in Texas. If we can move crude oil, a pollutant, thousands of miles for profit, surely we can move water, the essence of life, for survival. To the supporters of this plan, it represents the ultimate act of cooperative supply management. It is framed as a win-win scenario, a modern engineering marvel that would stabilize the volatile Western West while creating a lucrative new revenue stream for the Canadian economy. They envision water as not a sacred resource, but as a bulk commodity, no different than timber, electricity, or petroleum. In this worldview, geography is an obstacle to be overcome by human ingenuity. The blueprints exist in the minds of planners and politicians who see a pipeline not as an invasion, but as a lifeline. However, what looks like salvation from the perspective of a Phoenix City planner looks like something far more dangerous from the other side of the border. It is here that engineering feasibility crashes headlong into political reality. Canada's reply arrived with a clarity that left no room for reinterpretation. Officials in Ottawa stated flatly that Canadian freshwater would remain within Canadian borders and that this position was not flexible. Leading this ideological defense was Mark Carney, a figure whose arguments carried the weight of a man who has managed the economies of nations. Carney reinforced the refusal with firm, measured language, explaining that Canadian water is not a product that can be turned into a tradable export. It is part of the national identity, the ecosystem, and the cultural fabric of the country. Carney's stance did not rely on emotion. It relied on a cold, hard calculation of sovereignty. He argued that water must be viewed as a public trust rather than a commodity. This distinction is not merely semantic, it is the legal firewall that protects the nation. To understand the depth of Canada's fear, one must look beyond the water itself and into the complex machinery of international trade agreements. This is where the trap lies.
The core of the resistance is rooted in a terrified understanding of agreements like the USMCA, the successor to NAFTA. In the eyes of trade lawyers, once a natural resource is turned into a commercial good and sold across the border, it becomes subject to the rules of the global market. If Canada were to permit the bulk export of water, even as a one-time emergency measure, it could inadvertently reclassify its rivers as a tradable good. Once that legal threshold is crossed, the protections of sovereignty dissolve. Under the principle of national treatment, often embedded in these trade pacts, a country cannot discriminate between domestic users and foreign customers once a market is established. This means that if Canada turns on the tap to sell water to California today, it may lose the legal right to turn off that tap in the future, even if Canada itself faces a drought. Stopping the flow could be interpreted as a trade barrier, opening the Canadian government to multi-billion-dollar lawsuits from American corporations and severe economic retaliation. The water would no longer belong to the Canadian people, it would belong to the contract. Carney framed this potential dependency as a one-way valve. A nation that commodifies its most vital resource hands the control of that resource over to international tribunals and foreign demand. It signals a loss of authority over something that should never fall under foreign influence. For Canadians, the nightmare scenario is not just losing water, it is losing the ability to say no. It is a future where the hydration of the American Southwest becomes a legally binding obligation for the Canadian North, regardless of the environmental cost. This is why the resistance is so absolute. It is not just about protecting a resource, it is about preventing a precedent that once set would strip the country of its power to decide its own future. In this high-stakes game of poker, Mark Carney knows that the moment Canada puts water on the table, it has already lost the hand. Beyond the legal entanglements, Mark Carney's warning extended to a far darker reality: the ecological and ethical collapse that follows when we try to re-engineer the planet's circulatory system. He painted a picture of a future where short-term economic desperation overrides millions of years of natural balance. To treat massive river systems merely as plumbing to be rerouted is to invite catastrophe. Large-scale diversion of Canadian fresh water would not just lower water levels, it would alter entire biomes. Wetlands that act as the kidneys of the earth would dry out, forests that sequester carbon would wither, and the indigenous communities, whose cultures are inextricably tied to these waters, would face a second wave of displacement. The terrifying truth is that biological systems do not negotiate. Once a river's flow is disrupted, the damage is often irreversible. We would be trading the permanent health of a continent for a temporary reprieve for desert cities that perhaps were never meant to sustain such populations in the first place. But the dystopia Carney fears most is not just environmental, it is humanitarian. If Canada capitulates, it legitimizes a global model where water is no longer a human right, but a luxury asset reserved for the highest bidder. We risk entering an era where the divide between rich nations and poor nations is measured in liters. Wealthy countries will be able to purchase their survival, piping in security from distant lands, while poorer nations are left to face the brutal reality of climate change alone. Access to clean water would transform from a guaranteed necessity into a privilege of the elite. This scenario reshapes global stability in ways difficult to predict but terrifying to contemplate. It hints at a future where water is weaponized, where diplomatic power is held by those upstream, and submission is forced upon those downstream. In this world, the next century's conflicts will not be fought over ideology or oil. They will be fought over the simple, terrifying right to exist. This is the precipice upon which North America now stands, poised between cooperation and the commodification of life itself. At the heart of this dispute lie two competing philosophies, now locked in a quiet but intensifying collision. One views water as a tool for economic salvation, a resource to be engineered and moved like oil to sustain a way of life that nature can no longer support. The other views it as a heritage resource, a sacred trust that must be protected for future generations, regardless of the price offered. Both perspectives emerge from a genuine urgency, yet they point toward vastly different futures. As the century progresses, the question will no longer be theoretical. The American West stands as a warning of what happens when we ignore nature's limits, while Canada stands as the fortress trying to hold the line. But the ultimate question remains unanswered, hanging in the air like the shimmering heat over the Colorado River. When the thirst finally becomes unbearable, will a line on a map be enough to stop the flow?